So welcome everyone to today's seminar. We're delighted to have an old friend and former colleague, Chris Desmond, with us today. Thanks for coming up, Chris. So Chris is currently the professor of economics and the Derek Schreier and Cicely Campbell Chair in Development Economics at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. His research examines health and social policy related to human development over the life course, amongst many other things. Chris is, for those of you who are longtime DGHSM faculty members or affiliates, Chris spent a number of years with us when we were all together with the FXB Center under Jim's leadership back in 2008 to 2011. Chris today is going to speak about how taking a more holistic view of people in adverse condition changes the way we respond to them. Chris?
Thanks, Joe. And thanks, Joe, particularly for organizing it, but thanks for all of you for coming along. I really appreciate the time. So I wanted to talk about quite a few different things. I'm going to go quite quickly, mainly because I also want to hear what you think. So when I explained this idea to Joe, it was really to say that I've been struggling with some of these issues for a while. And so I come here as much with questions as answers. That, how do we move this type of thing forward? If you agree that this is something that we should be moving forward. But really, Joe's already spoken to what is the main point, to say that when we stop compartmentalizing people and start to look at people in a more holistic way, does it change the way in which we respond to them? And if it does, is that a good way? And if it's a good way, how do we incentivize that to happen? Working when I was close.
You want to move the...
I'm moving closer. Oh, that's easy. So I want to start off with two quick stories. So the one we were just mentioning it now, and I'm famous for not sharing anything personal. It's a strange thing for me to do. But I'll start off with a story about my dad. In 1956, as an East Ender from London, he moved to be a missionary, a Franciscan ministry. As I was just telling the others, it makes an interesting story of how I end up being here. But anyway, we'll cover that another day. But as a Franciscan missionary to South Africa. And he arrives in South Africa to save souls, as you do. And while he's there, he is confronted by extreme poverty, extreme inequality, an extremely difficult circumstance. And he said, no, he can't do his job as a priest in this environment. So he started off firstly with economic projects for the communities in which he worked, trying to increase access to church land and so forth. Moved on to education projects, schools and such, in order to try and have a longer term perspective. And then they were going quite well. The projects were going quite well at the mission station at which he worked. And then the apartheid state declared what it referred to as black spots for removal. And the mission station was declared a black spot. And then one day they arrived with government vans, packed everybody up and moved them to the middle of nowhere, destroying the community who was there and causing a great deal of suffering to the people who were moved literally to tents in the middle of nowhere. And so he said he couldn't accept this, and so then spent the next number of years fighting against this, documenting it across the country, and getting a whole lot of press for it. So you can imagine the Franciscan in his sackcloth wandering around the country, causing all sorts of problems, created a lot of press as well. And the church was not very happy about this. With some notable exceptions, some very good supporters, but the church as a whole in South Africa was not impressed with this and were very unhappy about it. And eventually, when he did ask to be recused from his vows, normally the response is that they contact your local bishop and send your local bishop around to you to say, why don't you take some time off, think about this. The Vatican wrote back to him and said, that's fine. They were very happy to see the back of him. The second story, and then I'm going to relate the two, was, as Joe mentioned, many years ago, I was here and I was having a debate with Paul about how is it, I'm an economist, how is it that you can justify a beautiful hospital in one district and nothing in the next district? How is it that we can think that that's an appropriate response? Should we not divide the resources in half and say, let's do two decent hospitals in two districts. The debate went on for quite some time. And we had some examples saying, well, there is the importance of showing what you can do. So, the success of partners in health in demonstrating the use of antiretrovirals in difficult contexts is an example. But there's something else. Something else needs to explain that. And he had a strong sense that there was that something else, but we were both struggling to articulate exactly what that something was else that justified it. And what I see as a link between these two stories is that when you have a system that is designed for one thing, but you are trying to do something bigger, then you have this mismatch in systems, and that leads to a lot of the problems. In this case, the church, at least in South Africa, was interested in keeping its head down and saving souls. They were not interested in getting involved in the socio-economic, let alone the political context in which they found themselves. And for most people in the healthcare system, it's about health, and only in a much more narrow sense. And once you start trying to open the door to doing other things, you have a mismatch between the system and your goals, and that can lead to problems. Now, to bring that to a much more technical level, from an economics perspective, when you think about social medicine type interventions, based on any intervention, we're trying to look more to the context of changing the environment in which people live. If you evaluate it only in terms of health gains, and that's what I'll discuss, it's asking for too much. It's an inefficient way of producing health. But if you start to evaluate it in terms of human development, in terms of taking that more holistic view of people, perhaps it's asking for too little. Perhaps you could be doing, in fact, more. Should be saying we should be doing more, and that health is an avenue through which you can improve human development. So you can expand, as Amartya Sen refers to as the evaluation space. You can expand the evaluation space in order to accommodate these broader goals. And we've done that. I'm going to give you some examples of that. But what we've found, and what others have found, is that were not designed to accommodate them. So we can tell health that by doing it in this way, you're also going to have all of these other benefits, and they don't care. Not across the board, but many of them don't care, and that creates a problem. And then I want to pose the question of whether there's a growing urgency for this. In an environment that's increasingly characterized by crisis, whether it's pandemics or it's climate change, do we need to be thinking about a shift to improving human development outcomes more with greater urgency, because the human development allows the resilience at a community level, an individual level, and at a country level to navigate those crises. So does it create a renewed urgency for this? Before I get into the examples, I just wanted to go through very quickly some of the frameworks which I use to help me think about this, just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. I'm going to go through them quite briefly, but just to give you an idea, and it's building on the work of three people. So Maslow in the first instance, then Martha Nussbaum, and Steve Biko, who's a South African activist who I'll speak to. So these are all in trying to think about how do we think about prioritizing in an adverse context. So, are we maximizing health? Are we maximizing education? What are we trying to do? And the general argument which I've been working towards is to say, have we gone too far in specialization? Have we been trying to identify how we improve one single outcome at a time? And are we missing something by doing it? And so the first one, so Maslow, and I refer to this as Maslow's ghost, because it's not really Maslow, it's not how he actually talked about things, but it's a way in which Maslow is understood in this hierarchy of needs. So we were doing some work looking at how people respond to other people's children as opposed to their own, and how you characterize other people's children as opposed to your own. And it seems that many of those responses, at least in the international setting, are shaped by this Maslowian ghost that we have. That there are basic needs, and so that we should focus, if you're at a distance, on those basic needs, on the physical needs, and perhaps on the safety needs. But the higher order needs are not really a concern, because we must deal with those more important basic needs. Well, what we felt is that this misses a point that basic needs, such things, so higher order needs, esteem, self-actualization, dignity, are important at all levels. There's no that if you're hungry, you do not feel shame. Sharing with Joe earlier, there's a lot of evidence around shame being a common feeling around people living in poverty. And that suggests the absence of a higher order need being met. It's not only that it's characterized by hunger and other basic needs. So we thought about flipping Maslow's pyramid first to its side to say, well, actually, you need a little bit of each thing. And then as you go up, you need a little bit more. But that doesn't capture that you can indeed meet all your physical needs, which is perhaps more what Maslow was getting at, and still need other things. And so we resize the pyramid to say, well, at higher levels of income, you may end up focusing more exclusively on esteem and self-actualization because your physical needs, your basic needs and safety needs are already met. but it doesn't mean at the lower level that you don't think about those things. And if we do start to acknowledge this more non-hierarchical nature of needs, then it starts to point towards the importance of individuals and families and communities' capacity to navigate the environment. Because you can't, from a distance, even a social distance, even if you're physically in the same area, but you're not with that person all the time, you can't guess at what need they will need at every moment. So when we were thinking about children, that's clearly true, is that to respond to children in adversity from a distance doesn't make sense when you realize that their needs are multiple and ever changing and across all these different domains. It makes sense then to invest in the family, because the family is there to see on a day-to-day basis what is the need that needs. So rather increase the capacity of the family in order to help the child respond to their needs or improve them, to help the adolescent navigate their environment with these changing needs at any time. So the first one is to take away the hierarchical sort of thinking about need. And that gives it at one point in time. We wanted to think a bit more about needs over the life course. So building on Martha Nussbaum's work, she had this very nice idea in the capabilities approach of basic, internal, and combined capabilities. So basic being the more physical elements, internal being the things that you learn, and combined being how they fit with the environment. The example she uses is political participation. So you need the physical capabilities to be alive and around, that's the basic. But then you need to learn how the political system works, how you might vote, how you would interact with institutions. But that only becomes a combined capability if the environment allows it. So there are, I mean, she uses gender as an example. There are many women who understand perfectly well the political system, but cannot participate in it, so they don't have the combined capability. Now, I think that's a brilliant framework, but it misses, she almost talks about the basic biological capabilities as automatic. In fact, she uses the word automatic, that they develop automatically, and they don't. Over the life course, there are influences on the biological basic capabilities. We rather look at protecting and realizing and utilizing capabilities, human development. And we see that protecting, which I'll explain in a second, is much more important in the early years. Realizing becomes more important through childhood, and utilization becomes more important in adulthood. All of them remain important to some degree, but they're sensitive at different levels. So by dividing it up this way, we think about protection as setting the developmental ceiling for an individual. So it's the potential, human development potential that could be realized in the best possible context. Realization or realized potential is the potential that has been realized at that point in time. So that's somewhat similar to Nussbaum's internal capabilities, what you've managed to develop at that point in time. And utilization is the amount that you get to use. Now, why we find this useful is it allows us to separate out these different influences and see both the importance of responding over the life course in different ways, but also the potential for responding to those. So if you think about Heckman's view of early childhood development, gives you the sense of these really high returns early in life, which is true, but really that's about protecting the developmental ceiling. You still have to realize that. So when you think about that example, in a perfect, you would have, the protective potential gradually declines. Potential is a use it or lose it thing. And over childhood and as you approach adulthood, you would realize that potential that you have. And then you would be in an environment which would allow you to put that to use. You'll utilize it. This comes later. But now, if we think about the way Heckman describes early childhood, is that protection is very sensitive in the early periods. So some adversity in the early period, you see a drop in protection, and that's through biological mechanisms that are associated with early childhood. But in a perfect world, then the child would still reach that ceiling, and they would still be able to utilize that ceiling if the world is perfect from that point onwards. But that's not a realistic description of the world. So typically what happens is when faced with adversity, children experience adversity early on, they see that drop in the ceiling, but the adversity continues, they never realize even that ceiling, and they definitely don't get to utilize even what they realize. Well, this is a sad story, but it's also quite a positive story in the sense that we don't have to write off children who had a bad start. There's plenty of improvements in human development occur later on, but it also suggests that in this scenario C, even if you intervene early and you increase that ceiling to its full height, if there aren't the opportunities to realize that, then you're not going to see the benefits of having done that. And so we really need to see people not only in the moment in their fullness, but over their life course and think about how we can intervene across those. And I wanted to bring in Steve Biko. I'm not sure how many of you, those who are somewhat older remember Cry Freedom, which was a Attenborough movie about Donald Woods and Steve Biko. He said at the time he had to have a white lead in Donald Woods, otherwise nobody would watch it. So he didn't make a movie about Rico alone. He then made a movie about guns. I found that, but that was his argument of why it needed to be this relationship between the two. So he was the founder of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa in the 60s and early 70s. And his emphasis was internalization of oppression. So he told the story that as a young Black person growing up in South Africa, everything negative you see is Black. People living in poverty, people struggling at school, people on the news for criminal activities. Everything positive you saw was white. So good schools, sporting success, wealth, and so forth. And that this had to have an impact on your perception of yourself. And the key thing was to overcome that. So it's one of his most famous quotes being that most potent weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And so he was about freeing that. And always, it's a rather cynical approach, but one thing that's very interesting is that if you want to know the thoughts and arguments which are most dangerous to an oppressive system, you watch how the oppressive system responds. So Mandela, very powerful ideas, but he was imprisoned. Biko was murdered. So they knew the dangers. So they said that we're not going to have any of this, and they, I mean, he was murdered. He wasn't formally executed. He was beaten in prison until he died. But his approach was to say that we need internal effects of an oppressive environment and ways in which we can overcome those in order, as he puts it, to create a more human face of society. So how to then take these ideas and think about that, expanding the evaluation space so we can see the benefits rather than just focusing on one thing. So some work that I did with others for something called the UKRI GCRF Accelerate Achievement for Adolescents in Africa Hub. I'm obliged to say that. So it's a very useful project where we were trying to look at what are the, and this is where you might see some of the overlaps with some. So what? But we also found that that you couldn't see the value of them within a sector. And so we're trying to start to think about ways in which we could expand that and see the value more holistically. So we did a simple model here to demonstrate the point using South African data, but it's a model example. We thought about a cohort of adolescents in South Africa, and we looked at the actual risks, I mean, this real data in this sense, of experiencing violence within a year, of dropping out of school in this age band, and of acquiring HIV. So you see 25% will experience violence in the year, 12% school dropout, and 1% across males and females at this age was 17. But then we said, well, let's do a scenario. Let's take the money. We take a fictitious amount of money and say, let's divide that between 3 ministries. One ministry is responsible for health, HIV outcomes. One ministry, social development, is responsible for violence. And one ministry, education, is responsible for education. How would they each? Now, we looked through the literature and we identified what we could find as the most cost-effective intervention. I think the figures are in Rand here. So the most cost-effective intervention for each of those outcomes. And we compared it to one of the interventions which the group had identified, which was a cash transfer parenting support for the most vulnerable families within that cohort. And if you look at each sector, so the life skills program, you can pay 5,600 odd Rand per case of violence averted. But if you did it through a parenting and cash transfer program, it would cost you 12, almost 13,000. And similarly, you see that the school dropout would be best done through strengthening the school system, and the HIV would be best averted by voluntary circumcision. And so you wouldn't pick the bottom one for any of them. If, however, you took all the money and pushed it into the family, you would actually see an improvement across the board. Small in school dropout and HIV, so approximately same impact, but a big improvement in the violence outcome. So if you take this whole of government perspective and say, let's invest a full budget in the intervention, which actually improves all 3, you can actually improve your efficiency. So often in the literature, you see in much of the social medicine discussions, it's talking about how cost effectiveness pushes away from these interventions. Well, it's often cost effectiveness if the outcome is only in health, once you start to include the other outcomes, what is considered even cost effective, which is often presented as quite a negative way of evaluating things, can shift. And that's what we saw here, at least in this example. One. And then to give you a sense of across the life course as well, how that perspective becomes important. We were asked to look at improving nutrition and evaluating interventions to improve nutrition in Burkina Faso and South Africa. I'll talk about both examples. So early nutrition is particularly important for long-term development. It protects brain development and so forth. It also decreases the suffering of the child at the particular moment in time. And so in Burkina Faso, it's very high rates of malnutrition, and so it would seem to be a very good target intervention to do. So we modeled, there's 10 interventions which are established in the literature as the main 10 interventions which you should do for responding to malnutrition. So we said, let's model the impact of improving these interventions in Burkina Faso, but let's do it across different areas, because the different areas in Burkina Faso are very different. The center region is not greatly affected by the conflict. It's the wealthiest area. The north region is the poorest region, and the Sahel region is the region most affected by conflict in Burkina Faso. And so if you invest this money, if we increase these 10 services to 80% coverage between 2023 and 2027, you see a decrease in lives lost. And as you would expect, you see the highest numbers in the worst off regions. So the regions with the highest levels of stunting, so 44, almost 45% stunting in the Sahel region leads to the largest improvement. And that's what you'd expect. And it seems like there you have an intervention that is working well, it's targeting effectively, it's leading to the biggest impact in the worst off region. So you see there, as I said, the decline in stunting. It's a small decline, but stunting is a very stubborn outcome, and so that's not surprising, but it's still quite meaningful. Almost 4 percentage points in the Sahel region. And then we look at that measured in productivity, the returns over the life course. And I'm not a great fan of productivity as a measure of value, but it gives a sense of the return that is occurring over the life course. And now the picture changes dramatically. So if you invest, for every dollar invested in this intervention at a national level, you'll only get $1 back. So now it's not starting to look like such a great intervention. In the center region, though, it doesn't look too bad. For every dollar you invest, you get $2 back. And as this is productivity returns, that means $2 per dollar spent accruing to children over their lifetime in the center region. So it's a private benefit that is occurring there. In the north, 1-to-1. In the Sahel region, 0.2. For every dollar spent. So in that sense, it's not what, but there is that in the center region, there are schools to go to, there are jobs to get. So your improvement in nutrition plays out over the life course as a much more valuable intervention. A much more valuable intervention. Whereas in the Sahel, the schools are closed because of the conflict. There aren't job opportunities. So there is no scope to use that benefit. So while we see this large benefit, if we stop there, so we did a good job, that benefit won't really be realized or utilized. We'll have protected this potential, we'll have protected these children's growth, but we won't have taken it any further. So we certainly want to think about, and I'm going to come back to this just to flag it very quickly, but how also that feeds into the system in somewhere like Burkina Faso. So part of the drivers of the conflict in Burkina Faso is the inequality between the center and the Sahel and other regions affected by the conflict. So now you invest in nutrition, which is a good thing, but you've actually increased the inequality over the long term. And so how do we, and that's going to feed back into the capacity in that region. It's going to feed one example, but all the investments are going to interact in a similar way. And you may in fact be weakening the stability of the state by investing in such a narrow way. So just very quickly, we did the same in South Africa, but in this case, to look across economic groups. So we just jump straight here to the cost-benefit ratio. You see that the lowest quintile, quintile 1, the poorest quintile, for every dollar invested, you will get 16. Already you see much bigger figures here because South Africa is a much better off environment in terms of potential for productivity than is the Sahel region in Burkina Faso. But you do see this gradient. So even though nutrition is nowhere near as much of a problem in the 5th quintile as it is in the 1st, your value in terms of productivity will be highest in the fifth quintile. So 23 compared to 16. We said, well, what if we complement that? What if we do something more? And so we looked at, well, let's say we could improve school quality, just closing the gap 50%. And you start to see it starts leveling out. And then we said, okay, well, let's imagine, this is now an exercise in imagination, but let's imagine we can create an environment where kids go to the same quality of schools and have the same opportunity for employment. Now you start to see the pattern you'd expect. Responding to malnutrition will generate the largest returns amongst boys, but only if it's followed up with interventions later in the life. So we've done all this and we identify these interventions, and there's other examples of these interventions that take a more holistic perspective, the benefits of them. But the problem is no one listens to them. And there have been others who've done this before. So a very technically very elegant approach was the co-financing approach, which was promoted a lot by UNDP, was developed by Michelle Reagan. It's a very nice way of saying, let's look at interventions and assess their value across sectors and determine how much each sector should be prepared to contribute to that intervention so that we do take this whole of government perspective. It's a very nice method. And so this is depicted in this figure. It's that the money is then transferred to the ministry that's going to implement according to this calculation, and that ministry then implements it. They created a toolkit, they did workshops across sub-Saharan Africa. Nobody did it. And so then, after the fact, it was good for them, they did some work with policymakers to say, well, why didn't you do it? And they said, well, in health, we're not particularly interested if there are outcomes in education. So we're not going to include their outcomes unless they give some money. And education is not going to give some money because they're not going to let go of any of their budget. That's where a lot of their power comes from, and a lot of their visibility comes from. They want to be the department doing the spending in order that they can claim the benefit from it. If they now transfer some of their budget to health and it generates educational benefits, they're not interested in that. That doesn't serve their purpose. So you can expand the evaluation space in the way which I described, in the way in which co-financing does, but it's not enough. It doesn't lead to the outcomes that we want to see. So can we, and this is where it starts to get a bit more questions, can we start to develop systems which align incentives? And so we've done some thinking about this. We said, well, there are examples of funds where at least the money is held centrally, so it's not having to be handed over by a department, and that could be directed by some kind of central planning. So some kind of planning commission can say, it would be good if you shifted your way in which you do something in health, or the way in which you do something in education, to consider the benefits across government, and we will allocate you additional money. So at least you're not asking another department to do it. So there's maybe some hope in doing that approach. Another one is to have that fund, but for ministries to bid for money, to say, well, if we change what we're doing, we will improve these benefits in education, but we want you to pay for that. And if they can make that case, then they would receive the money. And this has been used in some places. New Zealand has an example of this, where they have this bid-based system, and it's been used with some success. But it's tinkering. It's trying to change a few of the incentives to see this change. I'm not sure how big a change these approaches would lead to. So a question, and I mean, it's such a question that I didn't even put my answer because very preliminary, is do we need to be thinking bigger about this? Do we need to think about, for example, establishing a Department of Human Development and have health, education, and social development purely as implementing arms, that the policy is set at a higher level so that we can start thinking of it? I'm not saying that's the right idea, but do we need to be thinking about larger changes in the structure of government in order to align the incentives with the political and economic incentives of people within the government, so that they align with the benefits that you will see by taking this more holistic perspective? I don't know the answer of how we might do that. And then we have to deal with the fact that not everyone wants to see this. So if you do take a step back and see the whole person within their context, it's part of seeing the whole person, and targeting this broad range of outcomes, we can, and we've given some examples here, and I'm sure you know many examples from your own work. You can lead to the identification of more efficient interventions, at least more efficient in the terms of generating human development. And as a result, you can improve human development. And you possibly can do more. Highlighted that, and we'll come back to it, because I think the process of taking a more holistic perspective also changes outcomes in ways in which we don't necessarily capture here. And I want to talk about that in the sense of what they might generate in demand. But so if there is this benefit, why don't people see the value of this perspective? Now, many people have written about their vested interests here. Within governments, within international sectors, there are people who benefit from the system, the delivery system as it is, and indeed the social system as it is, and don't want to see these changes. So we have vested interests. But there's also motivated reasoning, and this could be a presentation in its own. But motivated reasoning is going to people actively avoid information. So if we think that people, my conceptualization of people is that they are generally good, that if they see a responsibility to help, they will help. But your response, you can also try to avoid seeing the responsibility to help. So it's a nice picture of a person that they have almost a constraint, if you like, that once they feel this much responsibility to help, they will help. But a constraint, if it's internal, means you can try to avoid that constraint kicking in. You can avoid the information, you can avoid the interpretation of that information. And it only makes sense as a constraint, because if it was a preference to help, you would never avoid information. You'd want to know all the opportunities there are in the world for you to help, because it was your preference to help. It only makes sense if it's a constraint. If as people, we will help if we feel enough responsibility, but we can avoid feeling that responsibility. So we can accept some responsibility around health, for example, but once you start opening it up to these other outcomes, that's quite dangerous, because you can start breaking down this whole view that limits your responsibility, and it might lead to this kicking in of this constraint that now compels you to help. So there's an active resistance. An extreme case of this is also to think about the value of dehumanizing. So compartmentalizing people and dehumanizing them has their value, and also at the extremes, racism, sexism, they have a huge value to the race system that exists. So in South Africa, imagine in apartheid South Africa, to be a white racist was much easier in many ways than to be a white non-racist or anti-racist. Because if you acknowledge the humanity of Black people, then you have to do something about the system which is benefiting you so much. If you're a racist, that's very valuable to you. You can just push those people out of your moral sphere. You don't have to worry about them because you've dehumanized them. So because of that value, there is active resistance to changing that view. That prejudice serves a purpose. And once things are valuable to people, they will defend it. And so racism, sexism are defended, not because they're necessarily strongly held views, they might be those too, but because they are useful. And so we have to think about how that shapes our efforts to take this more holistic view, because it humanizes people in the process. And by humanizing people in the process, it starts to make you question systems which you don't want to question, and people will resist that. And in trying to do that, I find it very interesting that when I read on this topic, so when I read Paul's books and when I read Amartya Sen and others, how much they resort to literature. And I think it's this hope that, narrative medicine being a very strong narrative medicine, the idea that, through literature, through reading, you can start to take another's perspective and you can shift your view. And so it's as if Paul and Amartya Sen and others are taking their own narrative medicine approach in their writing. They're trying to say, look, can't you see the story? Why can't you see it the way in which because if you saw it the way I saw it, you would be compelled to act. So we use a lot of narrative to try and get people to change their perspective. And that might be the key, is are we finding always the right narratives to do that? Maybe that is the way to try to get people to change. So that's the persuasion. That might get people to see it in a different way. And I think that's more important than the appeals, because we do a lot of appealing for people to change their mind. We're asking people to change their mind. And when these things are valuable and they're held onto, no one's going to change their mind just because. And a lot of what we've been doing is trying to push this, like, please, because we see it, but, taking a big we here, but we see it in a particular way, and we don't understand why they then can't see it in that way too. And there's a quote, again, during the apartheid years, someone from the ANC, they had some big defeat or something, they said, can't you give us some victories? I said, well, no, victories aren't given. And so, appealing is along those same lines. There are then approaches enforcement, so a rights-based perspective. In South Africa, we use that a lot. Taken to the courts, we have a very good human rights framework, and we try to force the changes to see people more holistically, to say you cannot accept certain standards of care being delivered. That has some hope, but the government just ignores many of those things. And so I'm not sure how far we'll get with it. I think it's very important, but there are limitations. And then what we've been thinking about, can you change the system? Can you change the structure of government in ways in which will change the things that we see and the way in which bureaucrats act within that? Or, to link back, can you change the way in which people demand it? And that's where Biko comes in. Biko's argument was that through this process of internalizing oppression, many people place into their environment. They just accept the treatment that they get. And I've been to many public health settings or government settings in general in South Africa, and people are treated appallingly, and they just take it. They're told, you know, it's 1 o'clock, we're closing early today because it's somebody's birthday, you need to go home. And they go, come back at 5 o'clock next morning, start queuing again. And so what is it that, you know, people have been pushed by the system so far that they've become to accept that? Maybe they think it's pointless to respond, but maybe they've also thought, this is my lot, this is the way in which the whole society treats me, maybe this is where I am. And so do we need to think about ways of changing the demand as well? Coming to this. So when I think about these challenges that, you know, at some point they feel too big. You know, the whole system is unfair. There's, you know, these economic drivers at a higher level, interest groups, it pushes all the way down to an individual's health and individual's education, and it's too much. But then I think, you know, we don't have to solve all the problems. And I often think about South Africa's high points, which, you know, when people think it was 1994, it's the World Cup, the Soccer World Cup, that was our high point, we'll all agree. So we hosted the World Cup in 2010. We didn't need any technical assistance. We didn't need any loans. We found a way because the entire country wanted the Football World Cup. And we did everything we needed to do in order that we went into debt, we built stadiums, it was like we sacrificed a lot to do it. But when the country was united to do something, it did it. And it didn't need anyone's particular help in order to do that. So there's a capacity for people to do things. And the most powerful story in that one is that everyone was very worried about crime during the World Cup, and there was very low crime. And someone asked the police spokesman in a rare moment of honesty, said, do you think all your initiatives have worked in reducing crime? He said, no, I think the criminals are too busy having fun that they forgot. And so it was really like a united cause, you know, behind a narrative, and things worked. So maybe the challenge isn't to try and answer all of these complexities, all these levels, and understand all of these systems and how they interact. We should try to do that. But others can also do that. We need to, you know, recruit more. If we can get people to be asking the same question. So maybe not the question of how do we improve health, but how do we improve human development? Not maybe the question of how do we maximize long-term economic growth, but how do we improve the capacity of individuals, families, communities, and navigate an uncertain future. Maybe if we change the question somehow, we can start getting those results. And I think health has demonstrated that it's a very powerful point of entry. When you have resistance to change, acknowledging that people need to be alive is a very powerful way into the discussion to then open up, say, well, they also need these other things. We also need to think about more broadly. We also need to see that as people. And I think that's been a huge success around social medicine, is that it provides that entry point in a way in which other domains don't. But is crisis another? You know, during the pandemic, you know, the wealthy world shut down largely, closed themselves off. We were left on our own. It's fine. South Africa was more capable of responding, albeit in very odd ways, including banning the buying of certain clothing items. But it's fine. We did things. But you know, lower resource countries, there was an extreme challenge to be shut off. We didn't have access to vaccines, didn't have access to treatment, we didn't have the infrastructure to deal with it. So with the potential for these coming more and more often, pandemics, climate change, and so forth, do we need to be rethinking the importance of resilience at all of these levels, individual, family, community, society, and that requires this fuller view across to generate that more resilient environment. And then I bring this slightly odd point about, you know, if you read the literature, there's many people are angry. And if I think back to my dad was always angry, he was angry for his entire life, but angry in a very positive way. He was angry because he believed it didn't have to be like this. And so that we need to have that vision of like, what is a different way of doing this? Because otherwise you're just angry, that's just frustrated. But to be angry in a way, and I've often battled with this, is that when the picture is so big and you can't see a way to change all of these vested interests, you almost can't be angry. You start to become apathetic because you can't deal with it. You need hope in order to be angry in the right way. And so what I've started to think about and how Fishponds made its way into the title is perhaps in these small steps, in social medicine, in other settings, when you start to see the whole person, maybe that will start to lead to the large, because maybe as Bika was describing, maybe when you do have a more humanizing approach in services, when you do have a more humanizing approach in day-to-day interactions, and these thoughts go, I mean, Paulo Freire, Fanon to some extent, Hegel, if you want to go back, or more recently, Axel Honneth, there's a whole set of people thinking about how in which your relations with other people start to build a change. And to the earlier point, maybe it's then those people who make the change, by you just making some contribution to that. So while we can't deal with everything all at once, maybe we can do everything at every moment. So by seeing a whole person at every interaction, we do everything at every moment in that small way, maybe it leads to something bigger. And that's for me what Fishponds were. So Paul, as many of you will well know, wanted Fishponds in the hospitals. And in some ways, from an efficiency perspective, from health generating a ridiculous idea. But if it's an idea saying, you know, the rest of the world treats you very harshly, it doesn't see you, but you come here, we see you as a person, not as a patient, as a person. And we want this landscape garden, we want this nice fish pond for you. That says something. And maybe that intervention had its own value. Maybe not in reducing viral load directly, maybe not in reducing a case of TB, but in affirming a humanizing approach. If when we had a few more of those, maybe we could see something bigger, some bigger changes that we want to see, not just run by us, but run by the people who are humanized as a result. So to summarize, the questions I was trying to ask, and I'll give you my preliminary answers in a second, is do we need to take this more holistic perspective? Are we fine with our sector-specific responses, health, education, social development, security, whatever they are, or do we need to be stepping back and saying, let's see the person. Let's see the person in their full set of needs and across their life course. If we are to do that, do we need to change the system in order to accommodate that? Can we do that within the current setup? And does that mean we can do it by tinkering, like the funds that I spoke about? Or do we need to be thinking bigger? Do we think of reorganizing government in some way, or is that a ridiculous path to go down? And does the possibility of more frequent crisis make this even more important, that we take this view quickly so that we can build the human development that we need to navigate those crises, so that everyone can navigate their own crises as best as possible? And do we have the narrative clear to sell that? If that's what we want to do we have the narrative clear to try and change people's minds on that route? Oops, my very preliminary answers. Yes, I mean, that's why I'm here. If we are to maximize human development, we need to see the person. You're going to maximize human development by seeing a patient, a student, a victim of violence. Does it require systems change to accommodate it? It looks like we've tried to push these interventions, and I imagine you've tried to push these interventions to take a more holistic view, and people are not interested. The incentives don't align. And I think we do need to be thinking bigger. I think we need to be brave enough to say, maybe this system isn't working. I don't know the answer to what that system should be. I have my little idea about maybe it's human development ministry, but maybe it's the wrong idea. But I do think we need to be thinking bigger to get there. And I think more frequent crises make this even more important. You know, I think day to day, South Africa, we have a lot of crises, you know, on a small scale. Electricity goes off, the water goes out, we have high rates of crime, we have social unrest and all of these other things. If you have resources, you can insulate yourself from this. I live in that environment and I live very well. We have solar panels, we have water storage tanks, we have high walls. You know, you can navigate your way through that crisis. You don't need to look outside help. For those who are living in an informal settlement, the power goes off, power's off, with a door that won't withstand somebody's kick and a police force which won't come. That's a very different experience of the environment. So there's these environments become one step. We want more people to be in a position to respond to that. And it's a very negative argument around, but to even do more, to thrive within the environment, I think is going to be particularly important. Do we have the narrative clear to sell it to everyone? I don't. Maybe you do. I would love to hear more. But I think I'm trying to get there, which is what brought me here to say, perhaps there are people here who agree with the need for this different narrative, and maybe we can think together about that. But quickly, those are the papers if anyone is more interested, and I wanted to just bring this up to give a special thanks to my colleague, Catherine Watt, who you will see across the papers. It supports me on most of this work and a huge amount of the thinking around this as well. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Chris. Love to take questions. Can I start with one? Any thoughts about suggestions for either international development organizations or international, health bodies like WHO, the Global Fund, of things that they might be able to do to get closer to the kind of vision that you're outlining?
I've done something about this. It's very difficult. On the one hand, they have more flexibility. So, particularly some of the development agencies, not so much the WHOs, they're defined already as health. They suffer the same problems. UNICEF defined as children, and it's hard for them to look. The USAIDs, the other, the other bilateral organizations, they have this more flexibility, and you see it. So, in PEPFAR, many people complain in the early days, but what I say about PEPFAR is it's the one of the international donors that changed. They were willing to say that they were wrong sometimes and shifted what they're doing, always shifted in the right direction, but they changed. And one of the things they did is they did push more towards, in at least my field of responding to children, they pushed more towards family-based services. So they had that flexibility. So I think there's opportunities in those organizations to demonstrate the potential for them. They also have shown CEDA, for example, has supported a lot of school health programs, which are very useful. And it's an example of this, how education can be done in a way through the education system to improve health outcomes. But I think they could be going a step further. So in South Africa, we have the school health program. It's worked relatively well by South African standards. The funder is pulling out, wants it to be integrated, it's going to collapse. We're certain it's going to collapse because they're not interested in working together. That was the fund. Could they have thought of this from the beginning in the way in which they ran school health to try and do it in a way which would allow it to be taken over, that would speak to the incentives? And they assume that because it's a good program, it would just be taken over. It's not going to happen. And now it's going to fall. So the change in thinking of those, the WHOs, the UNICEFs are more cautious about. It's possible you get some shift, at least to see WHO does have some evaluation frameworks which do bring in more of the benefits outside of health. So I think they're seeing the importance of it, but it's more challenging for sector-specific organizations.
Joe, can you also ask if any people online have questions?
Sure. If anybody online has a question, madam, I'm going to call on you.
Yes, please raise your hand. I share that in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry, man.
Oh, no.
Do you have a question?
Do you have a
Oh,
question?
I didn't know. For the online people. Great talk. This is a very interesting subject matter. There's a lot of research here around adverse childhood events and their connection to chronic diseases, deviant behavior, and the low achievement over the lifespan. There's no consensus really amongst the people who are writing about it on what intervention applies. I think a big part of that is 51%, so 61% for African Americans, 51% for Hispanics, but so roughly 55% of those people of color groups will have adverse childhood events. And I think the large problem is it's too scary a number. Like, imagine those numbers in the population, and we're talking about more than half of the Black population and half of the Hispanic population. You combine those two groups together, that's a significant number of people, and the list becomes too large to think about how an intervention could take, and where actually to intervene. Is it the family? They've tried that for years. In the 90s, they tried a lot of family-based interventions that hadn't changed the numbers. So your case study was South Africa, and we're talking, so it's a different scale. We're talking about America versus South Africa, but what, if anything, if there was this one thing you think could change, if it was a fish pond, do we then put them everywhere? But what do you think is the hope for changing anything from social medicine? Because these lead to tragic consequences, from the health landscape.
I mean, I'm cautious about how much I say about here, so I don't understand the context well, but a few immediate thoughts in response. So there is a problem on the scale. I think sometimes we go so far in these pushing people to try and see it that we emphasize the scale and it becomes overwhelming. And then what my comments about motivated reasoning do is I think then you shut down people. They'll then say, look, it's not our problem. They find a narrative that makes it particularly not their problem, and then they want to move away. So the first thing is to say, how do we keep it, the sense of its scale, while also the sense that you can deal with it and won't be overwhelming a responsibility to accept? That's a huge challenge for me. Because I think when we have that, we don't have to solve all the problems. It's to get many people, my thoughts, we always need many people, governments and families at all levels. They are the ones who will figure out on a day-to-day basis, but we need to provide a story that says this is important but manageable. And I don't know how one does it. The other thought that I come up with is that, there isn't one thing. So I was always left an impact. I was at a presentation by Cesar Vitora, who's a child nutrition, an excellent guy from Brazil. And he makes this he does all the Lancet specialties. I mean, he's like one of the top people on child stunting, which is childhood adversity of a kind. And he said, in Brazil, we haven't found any interventions that work for stunting. The stunting has come down hugely. And so what he was saying there was saying that socioeconomic development, the cash transfers, the improving the overall context had dealt with stunting. Their special efforts to deal with stunting had failed. And so when we try and respond to one thing, it's not often worth it to make them, but that's why we need that broader evaluation frame. So, we can see the dangers of particular employment conditions for say TB. But no one is changing those employment conditions for TB. It's just, that's why I'm saying you're asking for too much. But if you point out that changing those employment conditions will also benefit this and also benefit that and also benefit this, then maybe it starts to become an issue. So would be to look for the connections. If there are adverse childhood experiences so commonly, I bet you the causes of them are leading to other bad things as well. And that the only way in which you can get the conversation to shift about dealing with that broader frame is by making those links. Because you're not going to change the whole of society in order to change adverse childhood experiences. People don't think it's worth it. But changing the whole of society will do more than changing adverse childhood experiences, if that makes sense.
We have a Zoom question from Alicia. Alicia, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please feel free.
You have appeared behind me.
Hi, Chris. It's great to see you, and thanks so much for this incredibly wonderful talk. I wish I were there in the room. So I guess I have a reflection and a comment more than a question, but as you know, I've worked on human rights-based approaches since 2003, when the UN issued a common understanding. There were human rights-based approaches to development, which were very aligned with human development, human rights-based approaches to health. And those tried to capture much of what you were talking about, the shift from a disease or a specific condition focus to a life course approach, changing the evaluative space to look at how, all of the things that a person goes through and the necessary social determinants in health, multi-sectoral, all of government planning, budgeting, et cetera, evaluations, and the reasons why and the emphasis on a change in narrative to focusing on human dignity and on the value of seeing the dignity across our shared humanity. The reason that those human rights-based approaches to health have only been marginally, partially successful has a lot to do with many of the things you talked about appealing to people and actors in power who are to concede rights, et cetera. About ingrained, entrenched structures of white supremacy, patriarchy, all the rest. But it also, in my view, has to do with a mismatch between the national and the global level. So you can develop legal enforcement of rights, you can articulate human rights-based approaches at the national level and start to develop policies and implementation programs, et cetera. But if the global order is increasingly dominated by neoliberalism, commercialization of everything, including health sectors, financialization in the last couple of decades, that is going to have an enormous impact on the ability to do the kinds of things that you're setting out that we should do. I mean, now in the wake of the pandemic, 60% of the countries in the world are drowning in debt and at risk of significant distress. That has effects on public sector wage caps. At Partners in Health, we're working on that in Malawi, for example. It's not those countries' fault, right? I mean, a lot of it, as you noted, during the pandemic, the United States printed billions of dollars and gave them out, and then we raised interest rates, and those countries are absolutely underwater, not due to mismanagement or corruption, but because of this global economic order, which also has everything to do with the intellectual property effects that you talked about during the pandemic. So I guess that's a reflection, but also a question to you about how much do we really have to target those global structural issues, because this is not just like the 2010 Olympics. This is an ongoing thing where the global north and multilateral institutions really have boots on the necks of of countries across the global south. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ellie. So you're hitting at what is my existential crisis. So I go back and forth between this. It's like you look across the cycle and you're 100% right. There's this global system. And actually there's a graph, Ellie, that you shared the other day, I think it's in your new book, about the share of wealth in private hands. And how, you know, the states, you know, the US and the UK was, I think, were the examples you used. You know, it's not that they can't afford things, it's that the money's all now in private hands. And when you look at these systems, I mean, it's just overwhelming. You just say, well, what can I do? I'm sitting here like I just can't do anything. And so it's almost that you want to then come full circle, say, well, these things all interact, they're all built in. And the hopeful story, which I've taken from some of your writing too, is where's the opportunity to generate the cascades? You know, where one change will lead to another, will lead to another, will lead to another. And I've been trying to use that thinking in trying to identify what one does. And you know where I come down, and I think we need multiple points. I think absolutely one needs to target the global system. I don't know how I would do it, just at a personal level, but I mean 100% agree that that's the root of the problem. But that you know what I can do is to say in South Africa, in the way in which we think about services, in the way in which we interact with people, can we make that a more humanizing experience in the hope that that contributes to that person, not just for their benefit, but for what they can also do to that system. And I know in some ways that's giving away the responsibility, saying, well, I can't do it, you go and do it, but I can't do it. And so, I mean, I oscillate between these, you know, let's, you know, go for the whole system, which you're 100% right, is what we should be doing and would be the fastest way if we could be effective. And then thinking, well, we can't be effective, so let's go right back down to the micro level. And I'll go back and forth, it depends on the day of the week. So you just hit across my main crisis. I don't know, is the real answer. Today I'm on responding to the individual. Next week I might be back to changing everything.
Okay, well, I have the same existential crisis, so let's keep talking.
I'm glad you mentioned the World Cup. I want to just say that I was there in Joburg when South Africa beat France in the World Cup in 2010. Flew down there from Ringquavu, where that fish pond was that you just showed, and it was unbelievable. Like, yeah, beautiful. I was in one of those watching parks that, like, yeah, it was a wonderful. Overall wonderful scene. Made me think South Africa was a lovely place to live for everybody. It was for a few weeks. So something that's this is a great talk. I really appreciate it. I'm struck by how hard this conversation is. Like your last bullet point was like, do we need a different narrative? And the language that we use to say the holistic effects or the indirect effects, over like the indirect effects, immediate and over long term, at all kinds of systems at multiple levels, ultimately improve health outcomes from a fish pond or something. It's a really tough language, and like I feel pretty confident on following everything that you're saying. I think most people probably do. But it's very hard to verify, right? So like take the fish pond example. Like, I don't think you need to talk about a higher level of systems. I think the fish pond increases human health in Ringquavu in the hospital. And I think it does that through a whole system of effects, right? Some of it is the dignification, some of it is creating culture, some of it is making it a nice place to work, creating a North Star that's like, there's a lot of things that affect, it's an organism, right? And it has a role in its overall organism. But like, what's the science of that? And it's probably unknowable. You probably can't actually, like, we can hardly show that healthcare improves health outcomes, you know, in like a place like Ringquavu or Madagascar. That's a really hard challenge. Show me that hiring a doctor and decreases mortality rates. And like, when it's a really hard thing to show, but fish pond, no way, you're never going to show it, right? Like it ain't happening. Like, and so what do you do then? So it's like, there's like this whole, it's like by the very nature of the indirect effects measure, and the very, which is like with the stunting, all the effects. So it's like, where does that leave us in like the research space of how you study things that you think are the most important things, which are the hardest to measure? So it can't verify anything you just said. I believed all of it, but it's unverifiable, right?
Yeah.
So what do you do with that?
Well, so a few things. One, I 100% agree with you on the language. And Joe and I were discussing this point and said, I don't have the language myself. I mean, so I keep fumbling with this. We've been planning a paper on this for literally years, and we ended up just like doing bits of it everywhere, because the language to explain it clearly and get the, it's incredibly difficult. And to measure it. We had this discussion, like, you can't get a hold of it. It's agreed.
And some fish ponds are better than others,
Yeah.
right? It's not like any fish pond,
And then
right?
in
Like,
some fish ponds, in some
it's
countries they will
context,
match, and
yeah.
others, and in others they won't. But it's back to that, you know, that conversation with Paul. In fact, he had the same hand gestures as you. He's gonna, like, I know it's right. I know it's right. It's dedicated his life to doing this kind of thing. But I don't have, like, so it is a sort of jump of belief, but that's very hard. That's maybe easier in smaller settings and within an organization. But you're going to go and tell the minister that, you know, they need to make it. It's very hard, and
Yeah.
maybe the language would help us. But I mean, yeah, you and Ellie are the same. You're just speaking to my own existential crisis. That we know this is important. I get the sense that how, you know, we see another person changes everything.
See, I don't think it's an existential crisis. I think there is a better language, and I think we could get there, because I think most things are the consequence of indirect effects, and like the most important questions that humanity, to science or whatever, are hard to evaluate in the ways that we would require of, say, a health intervention, right? Like most of the phenomena in the world actually don't reduce to simple, like, whatever, linear interventions or something. And so it's like it seems to me that there's like a converging language, because the themes that you're talking about are themes that I'm hearing more and more in different environments in different ways, but not everyone's using the exact same language. But I feel like there's a way to get there, to say, you know, this thing is you can measure, this thing you can't. You could try to measure, but you're not going to successfully measure. But that's not the right criteria. That's not the right standard. And so then we have to like come up with another way to think about it, you know.
But I think it also is coming, you're saying we need to think about it in a different way, so we can find a way to make these immeasurable things measurable. But I think it's more so, how can we sit with being okay that some things aren't measurable? And as you had mentioned, all of the things that actually are that which change the structures we want can never be measured. And so I think it requires kind of a relinquishment of ego, and ego within research and academia, that in the pursuit of verification for life, in the pursuit of verification and the pursuit of precision, we end up doing a disservice, because we actually, to your comment about these constraints that we place as a society and who we can moralize or not and dehumanize, and by virtue of that, I think we even do this within research, is that we create these kind of false constraints for the purpose of our own, I say ego, but I know it's more than that, because you, at the end of the day, you want your work to be meaningful. But when we think about things being measurable, another way of saying, like for the fish ponds, I'm not super familiar with the work, so I apologize for that. But I'm sure you could ask the people who you're serving there to provide comments on that. And that could be the most important information, even if you're not measuring it. And so I think that there's value in questioning how we're doing things, rather than changing the question to fit our hope to have things measurable.
And what Matt, we were talking beforehand, you know, about, we pointed to pivot, you know, space, for instance, right? It's like, what are you all doing? I mean, kind of talking a little bit beforehand about, well, how do you measure these things? And, you know, and the fact that like at a place like Rinkwabu, it happened, and then there was evaluation, but you all were much more kind of deliberate about putting an evaluative framework in before you started the intervention. Like, I mean, how do you think about this, and what's the signals coming out of the work in Madagascar?
Well, the way that I think about it is, it's like similar. It doesn't get at like the fish pond question, although the fish pond question comes up all the time, like as a practical matter of like, oh, we should do more landscaping around these hospitals. That comes up constantly. But so this doesn't fully address your thing, but we definitely see it as a system, and that we need to measure the things that we can, that do matter, whether people are getting more health access to healthcare, whether mortality rates are going up or down or whatever. But also a lot of the things that might influence those that may or may not be based on a hypothesis at the outset. That it's really hard to be disciplined about collecting data that's not hypothesis driven and still have it be focused enough to lead to like, and so the example that we give are like, we collect a lot of data on the pathways that people go from their houses or their villages to hospitals and health centers. And over time you start seeing, oh, these people have access to care and these people don't have access to care. So I would say I approach it like the way that I think about it is like as an ecologist. It's like you're trying to characterize the system at like multiple levels. So there's stuff that happens at the health center, at the place where care is being provided. There's population-based phenomena of like where people are, like where they're seeking care, and there's linking those and bringing in people who may see it differently. So that they can provide insights, like geographers, for example, and so then it's like, oh, you might not be asking the right question, but somebody might be able, but you're asking the question about the same system, and it's like, and you're collecting data in a way that allows everyone to be at least looking at the same thing,
And when you say when you say the system, do you mean this larger kind of this outside the health sector? Or
No. I don't. I mean, we do. I mean, I think of the system geographically as like a space, as a physical space. The thing about all these things is every system is part of a larger system, right? It's like there's like that's a never-ending thing. So there's like some unit that is like the space in which we can reliably collect information on. And I think to me, it's like inspired by these themes, but it doesn't really nail some of the most essential things that you're saying. But it's like it's resonant with it, or like it's congruent with it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Just to take a stab at the language, maybe it's a little hokey, but it seems like what I love about your presentation is it's ambition. It's like the economics of the common good is what it is. And like even the question of going upstream, we all want to go upstream, but is that like changes to the financial international order, or is it, an artist who's making the fish pond? And those are both in a way like the most upstream you could go to. And I guess the way that I'm putting it together is like they both are contributing to the common good in some sense. And like the way you slice the common good or do a research angle on some part of it or the other part, it still seems like for me that kind of unites like the research questions and the scholarship, but also the kind of how do we see each other as like, how do we make a human society, like a fully human society where you can look somebody else in the face, And I wonder if maybe that would be part of the language.
Like the common good within the hospital, so the fish pond is serving this a common space, a common good.
Yeah, the hospital has its common good, but then the hospital is also like a contribution to the different nesting levels of common good that all have to reinforce each other. But I don't know how to measure it too.
Yeah.
But maybe asking people.
But I think, do you have to measure? You talk about like being an ecologist and observing this in its space and the geography. You can appreciate, you can analyze, you can evaluate, explore. And you can still create a really deep understanding for the common good or whatever you want to name it, but it doesn't have to necessarily be measurable, because measurable infers a particular type of knowledge and a particular way of knowing. And I think really reinforces kind of the like epistemological hegemony of knowledge. And I think there's other types of being able to appreciate your intervention, though it may not be measurable in the way that perhaps you and I have been most trained to appreciate and use to advance even benevolently what we want.
So yeah, thank you for that. So given all these complexities, I'm trying to remember again what the distinction between the acute and chronic or the notion of the crisis gets here. I mean, it's already, if we just a chronic system, you could wrestle with all this. What is it about the crises that gives you, does it make it easier or harder?
No, so I'm just looking for inroads. So I think the crisis is, I'm involved in a lot of discussions around this with people working on the crisis, and I fear it's the same thing is happening again. We're limiting now. We're going to demark, our area of responsibility, and we're going to do it to acute crises. So there's lots of interest. Well, how do we respond to crisis? And they're talking about events. because events are more manageable, you respond and you go away. Whereas chronic crisis, I mean, there's people who live in chronic crisis, and that's not discussed. And so I fear that the crisis is another way of limiting responsibility. So I'm quite nervous about it and nervous about the discussions that are happening about it. But if we try, I keep finding myself trying to do this, this sense of thinking that everyone has these motivated reasons, thinking of kind of back ways in to get what you really want. But if we do persuade people that respond to acute crises, which is what they're interested in because it limits their responsibility through human development, in doing so, we start to address the chronic crisis. But it's almost like by the back door. Because I think to sell the chronic crisis is the case of it's too big, no one wants to take it on. But if you sell it as responding to the acute, then maybe we can address the chronic. But then maybe just to the point and find, I think it's possible, and some different languages are around and people get in there. But I don't know who would listen. That's the second part. And there's like, will they listen? Even if we get through, if they're resisting hearing the story, will we get there? And that's where, then to Addie's point, is where I get to the existential crisis. As you would have guessed, I grew up in a home that was like, we need a revolution because this system is so broken. We have to have a revolution. So it was in my whole childhood, we were heading towards a socialist revolution. It didn't happen. And so then our shift, maybe as a response to that opposite, is to say that if we can find ways to set it at the smaller level, that revolution, such as it may be, must come from below. The idea that we can conceptualize a system that we want to fight for is perhaps an arrogant one. And so I stopped trying to do that. And we say, can we do it from below? And that's what that's why I say everything in every moment. So can we say that these little steps, and can we find the narrative that at least set it so there are more of these little pieces going on, and then hope for Abby's, as she describes them, cascades that will lead to the larger change. I have to hope that. Otherwise, I will shift from being angry to being frustrated.
Any questions online? Well, Chris, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. And really, so I feel like we just left off having this discussion a decade ago. So thanks so much. And thanks everybody for coming out and for participating so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Eddie.